Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Wicked Problems. Today, my guest is Marcus Kirsch. Marcus has worked as a transformation, service design and innovation specialist for over 20 years. Today, he runs The Wicked Company, which also happens to be the name of his best-selling book. He helps organisations be better problem solvers and be more resilient. He's a Royal College of Art alumnus and former MIT Media Lab researcher. He's led projects for companies like British Telecom, GlaxoSmithKline, Kraft, McDonald's, Nationwide, Nissan, The Science Musician, Procter & Gamble, Telecom Italia, and many non-profits and startups as well. He's won awards in the areas of creativity and innovation and published for The Guardian, Wired, and other industry-relevant publications. He's a thought leader, a keynote speaker, and in his off time, a mediocre indoor climber, movie nerd, maker, and has one redeeming quality, which is that he likes his whiskies neat. In fact, he's got another redeeming quality as far as I'm concerned, because he's obviously somebody who understands wicked problems. So I hope you really do enjoy today's show as much as I enjoyed recording it. Enjoy. Hello and welcome to Marcus Kirsch, who is joining me today on Wicked Problems. It's great to have you here, Marcus.
Hey, Toby. Nice to be here.
I see in the background you've got a copy of your book, The Wicked Company. I thought it's quite...
I saw that.
Yeah. Wicked Company Week's Wicked Problems, right? So tell me all about the book.
Well, the book is sort of the brainchild or the result of a gut feeling I had for over 10 years, I guess, working as a consultant in various different industries. And I felt there was a gap between what technology could do and how people were using it, and that they were quite focused on the features of the tech rather than how people's behavior had changed and generally how the world had changed because of the tech that's all out there and how we are also interconnected now, so that things had moved from very linear things to now very systemic and exponential things and behaviors. And that was never there. So people struggled not just to understand how these technologies work, the whole internet and social media and the Napsters and Pirate Bays and BitTorrent and all of that stuff, which for me as a digital native is sort of, I could see that progress and it wasn't too overwhelming. But for everybody else, it was just, oh my God, it's just all this stuff. And so I need to learn all these features. And I thought, no. Look at the principle of what it does. And that might give you an easier way to understand and not panic, to figure out what's going to happen or how people might be using this stuff, which is what you should be focused on. So after years of that, I kept trying to shape the narrative to help people understand it quicker, because that's what people would hire me for, to make sense of all of this. So in the end, I didn't give up. I just said, I'm one person. I can only be in a room with X amount of people at a time. You know what? Let's put it in a book. Let's talk a bit about what I know in a compressed version. Something takes you a few hours. Put it in a book. Get it out there. So I put the book together in sort of 3 parts, which a little bit looks at where wicked problems or this shift came from. I'm going all the way back to the Industrial Revolution. And then the middle ground sort of all about the tech and sort of how these things evolved as well since, let's say, the 90s up until sort of now-ish. And that they're more similar than different. They have all different names, but they're actually more similar. And, so you can relax a bit and actually, this is sort of what these things really do. And then the last part is a bit of looking into the future or looking into some companies who have adopted more progressive ways of working and ways of dealing with those new types of systemic problems. And so I wrapped this up into a neat little book. And so I wrote that, brought a lot of case studies in from my work, interviewed a couple of extra people on top of it. And that's the book.
And you based it on the theory of wicked problems, or at least it's got that concept ingrained into it. When did you first come across the idea of wicked problems? What was the because it's got its history. I mean, for me, it goes back to Horst Rittel and Mervyn Weber, I think it is. which is way back in the early 70s in design thinking. Is that kind of where you came across it, or did you?
Yeah. So for me, it was a bit of I sort of was using. So I'm a design thinking practitioner for a good 20 years. So that design thinking came out of Stanford, in combination with Horst Whittle coming over from Germany to Stanford, and a lot of other people seemingly as well. We just had someone on our podcast this week who talked about, there's other stuff that was going on at the same time that also influenced all of this stuff coming up. But essentially, yeah, same thing. So I was trained in design thinking. Oddly enough, at the time, no one mentioned wicked problems. It was just a design tool to use and, how to iterate through and do these things. So it was more under a design context without ever using the word wicked problems. Only when I started doing research for my book came I back onto that. I'm like, oh, that makes sense. That makes sense that this is actually quite different to, as they said back in the days, maybe the scientific and engineering approach doesn't work on those kind of problems. We need something else. And designers do that all the time. They work a lot with uncertainty and with small iteration and text and experimentation. But what I know now is that often when people are getting taught design thinking, they're not necessarily go all the way back down and say, well, there's wicked problems. And that's the main reason why design thinking exists. It's more put in a context of design, but maybe I've just been into many design colleges. But I've also seen it in organizations where it's quite theoretical to drill back down into that kind of thing. And I think therefore it seems to get skipped a lot, which is a shame because now we know with COVID and some other aspects, it's actually everywhere. It was in front of us all the time. And it's a bit like that for me, that it was in front of me all the time. And I've applied the methodology for 20 years, but only sort of in the last 2 years found through research that, it goes back to wicked problems and it goes back to a German, which is also nice.
Well, yeah, absolutely. You framed it in the context of the company, but I wonder if you could, maybe drill down a little bit more into that. So, for instance, are you talking about the entire organizational structure? Are you talking about specific projects? How give us a bit more info for the people who might be watching or listening?
Yes. So I think a good case study or example to bring up is probably a project I helped build over at BTIT, which was the most holistic approach I think I've ever done so far. Massive restructuring of BTIT, thousands of people working there, and they wanted to rebuild their factory that produces everything. So when you look at that, you look at everything from the way the internal organization works, which is a lot of people, a lot of departments, interconnectedness, a lot of people with different styles, ways of working, different philosophies, different belief systems of what we should do and not be doing, how things go, what things are not.
So competing logics within the organization, essentially.
Yeah, and I wouldn't always say it's a logic applied. It's a certain...
Well, a logic's still a logic, even if it's flawed, I suppose, but it's...
Yeah. I think people like to refer to a lot of things as logic, or it's logical for them, right? And that's really important when you look at these kind of things, because then it becomes more of a qualitative thing. But basically, you have all of that happening, and obviously then there's certain politics involved, which is a very wicked problem, those kind of things. So you have a lot of people involved. It's more a people problem than a tech problem. And you also have that happening on the customer side. In this case, it's sort of internal customers because they're serving all the other 4 or 5 businesses of BT. But they're customers nonetheless, the way it's set up. So you have that as well, where requests come in and they have different dynamics and they evolve differently, and so on and so on and so on. So I always see it as 2 sides to it. And service designers like to refer to it as the front stage and the backstage. Or you can say the customer experience and the colleague experience, right? The external and internal processes that you want to, or experiences you want to create. So they tend to be wicked problems. Why? Because as we know, one of the characteristics is you put something new in there, it won't fix everything, it won't bring in a solution, it will shift it to a different state that hopefully is better than before. And that's what you have, you throw some new tools at your internal processes and people will start using them, and they will start using them a bit differently and adopt them in a particular way. And different teams should be able to do it in a different way. Cookie cutter really doesn't cut it, no pun intended. But that kind of stuff is quite has all the characteristics of a wicked problem because it's mainly people driven that make all the difference. Same on the customer side. You throw new tools out or you bring new offers and products out, kind of use it different, then they have different requests and that shifts and so on and so on. And so on. The way you engage with them, therefore, it's an evolving system rather than the solution and you do it. So in that sense, we massively use design thinking to treat everything as a hypothesis, right? Not say you think you have a solution like they would usually do, but BT knew well enough that that doesn't work. They had a lot of failed projects. Said, no, we need something new. We need to be able to question assumptions because we've never done that before. So we built that into every team. And every team adopted it slightly different. The bottom line was that they were able to build essentially a business case and do research. And that made all the difference, where now you can incrementally test if something flies. You test it with reality very quickly. You have a different relationship with the customer or who you're building stuff for. And that made massive differences there. So that's a good example where, you use that theoretical approach. And there we rarely talked about wicked problems. We didn't have to. It was more about, and that's a simpler narrative a bit, to say, just treat everything as an assumption. This is new. You sort of know it's new, but you still treat it like the old. How about we check it out? How about we talk to the people? How about we ask questions rather than produce stuff? And that's the major step change for them, and it worked. Sure.
One of the things you touched on there was that it's this whole thing of wicked problems don't have a stopping condition, right? So people make this assumption that we'll do X, we'll have this project, the project will finish in 2 months, 3 months, 2 years, whatever, and then everything will be fine from then on in. But actually, change is constant, right? Which is, and as you say, there's lots of different, competing logics, as I put it, but also as you put it, everyone does things slightly differently, and therefore the domain in which you're acting isn't the same. Even within the same company, it's not the same because you've got different ways of thinking, different objectives, different shifting priorities, and so on. And I think you also said earlier you did a podcast just recently with somebody. I'm assuming this is a podcast that you host, that you then had a guest on who was very much in that domain as well. And I just wondered if we could learn about that.
Sure. So the podcast that came out of the book that I started roundabout in April with a good friend of mine, Troy Norcross, who's a specialist on blockchain and other these consulting companies. So we together came up with this format of looking at business books, relevant business books. That's sort of part of the puzzle of this, because as we know, wicked problems require a multidisciplinary approach. That means there's a lot of different and moving parts of puzzle pieces of the equation there. And we said, well, not everyone can read all the business books required to learn enough to create a better narrative. The other part is also that most books, because a lot of them are written by consultants like me, try to spin up their own language and have their own metaphors and whatnot. So everyone has a bit of a different language, but wants to do the same thing. Obviously, we're doing this in order to differentiate ourselves in the market, but it doesn't help the clients because the clients get more and more confused about. So what's the mountains? What's the milestones? What's this? And everything has different names, and you have different practices as well. You have anything from behavioral science, service design thinkers, agile practitioners, you have enterprise architects, you have business designers. They're all essentially trying to do the same thing, helping the business solve problems better. But we haven't reached the point yet where we said, hey, we're all sitting in this big bucket of problem solving or sense making, right? But we sort of are. I think maturity wise, we're not there. And to bring this all together, we said, well, let's bring these different books together, talk to the authors, create a couple of simple takeaways in 4 or 5 minutes. So, but give people the interview with the author to dig a bit more into what they're talking about in the book. Us try to translate it for different audience as well. So that actually the whole narrative comes a bit together, that the different voices maybe merge in the middle as a common language that we can all sort of a bit more agree on without jargon, and a bit more easier to understand for people who run organizations. So that's the aim of the podcast. So we're nearly at episode 20 now. And so we've done a variety of books now, anything from constant learning to, interviewing. We got quite lucky with getting big gurus like Tom Peters on, and just talk about, what is this now? How does your book contribute? Where do you think it sits? And what are your learnings? What are the new things that people should know? And it's been quite fun.
Tom Peters, as you say, is one of the gurus. Another one, somebody that I've done a lot of reading of his work is Keith Grint.
Yes,
who I think was on your podcast.
Yes, he was there last week, or a week before. Yeah.
Right. So who was? I think he's retired now, but he was the professor, a business professor at Warwick University in the UK, and his stuff's really worth reading. And if people want to Google that, they'll find a lot of stuff. But that explains the whole concept of the wicked problems, puts it into context. But I imagine for you, consulting on something where you say to people, so I can't give you a definitive stop state, right? End state. And the problem's a bit woolly. I'm just making, this is kind of how people might hear it, but how well received is it these days? Because I think if I'd said that to somebody, say 20 years ago, I would have just been shown the door, right? Because they would have said, no, I need a definitive state, and I need to know exactly where it's going to finish, how much it's going to cost.
Yeah.
And, and I think that it's a bit like the technical project revolution between, the shift from waterfall to agile, right? Where instead of having these monolithic projects that span over 2 years that say, and I need all of my requirements up front and they mustn't change in the 2-year period. Well, we all now know that things do change, right? New legislation comes along, hierarchies evolve within organizations, people leave, people come in, new technologies come to the fore, pandemics happen, things we can't plan for. Have you found that people are much more receptive? And what do you think is driving that receptivity? If that is the case?
I think that's a really good question. And I think it's probably a key question when you talk to anyone over in leadership. And I think the tricky part there is that, as you said, if you go in and you go from, oh, this is what you could be doing, to saying, well, I don't know where this is going, neither do you, and I won't be able to answer that to you. I think that's where this new narrative comes in, right? It comes in from, oh, well, just do what those guys were doing in your industry and you're probably going to be okay, which is probably what a lot of consultants have been doing over the years. Not saying that was right, but it sounded right enough to leadership, so they went for it. And as we know now, via McKinsey and others, 70% of those digital transformation things don't create the benefits because that's the old approach and it just doesn't work. I think it's still important to say, look, or maybe the way I approach it these days is this. I say, look, there's a high level of uncertainty. Things are always moving, but wasn't that always the case? If you look in an organization who tries to keep people working there for, let's say, 20 years, or they try to keep the same tech, not to invest on top of it and upgrade it and lose profit as long as they possibly can. But because of that, you have a lot of very, very outdated industries to the level that a couple of guys in a garage could compete with them. So all of this, and you can drive that all the way back to procurement, right? You can say, right, because you were so stingy with your investments, rejecting the idea that the world keeps moving, you're in trouble now. So can we go back to that and just agree on that truth that actually the world's evolving all the time, now visibly more than ever, because we reached a particular threshold where things will probably accelerate really badly quite quickly, and just half this year. The evidence is now out there. So as a silver lining, we can see this now. So hopefully there will be more agreement on that start and say, okay, well, if that's the case, the next question I would expect is like, so what are we going to do then? Well, what you need to do is, how do you deal with uncertainty? Well, you de-risk the hell out of it, which means you do a lot of incremental little things every day so that you can get a little bit better every day. That's what your competition, that's what some progressive competition is doing. If you set yourself up for that, you become pretty future-proof, because you're going to be able to see what's changing because you're checking often enough. You're going to be able to still pivot because you're not just from a team perspective and research perspective, but hopefully at that point from a financial perspective, you're able to put money against a new insight in a week.
So this is sort of aligned to the fail fast, pivot quickly kind of philosophy, right? So get the feedback. So I'm not showing you the answer. I'm showing you the process by which you can get the feedback that informs your decision so that you can make the right changes at the right time.
Exactly. And I think it's interesting how, what I find fascinating is that, I've been getting evidence of that, and probably you've seen the same thing, in all sorts of different places. Anything from the fact that Agile exists the way it exists, and it's a go-to thing now. The fact that, so we just talked to someone else who works over in Silicon Valley, and they say, like, we're throwing out new ideas every time. We build a little website, see if it sticks to the audience, and if it doesn't, we throw it away and we try something new. And it's basically free. You go to Wix or something and just spin up something for free, try it, send out a social media thing and see if something comes back. That's experiments, and they do it all the time. They don't see it as wicked problem solving or design thinking. They just know from an entrepreneurial perspective, this is sort of how you find your first customers and test a business idea. And what applies there applies to everything in an organization as well. Anything from improving onboarding to how your team structure works, to how you run your meetings. Everything can be tested. You can do this everywhere. You can improve everything. And in theory, that's what people often talk about as a learning organization, because an organization is a wicked problem. So inside, you should do the same thing, not just on the customer side, right? And if you get that kind of mindset into an organization, into the culture, then you're up to something quite amazing and something fairly flexible, actually.
So in a sense, what you're saying is that an organization is almost like an organism in the sense that, and it's sense making its way through the world, and it has to learn how and when to respond appropriately, and not just sort of march through the world thinking, oh, it's okay, I've got, I know the way forward and I'm just going to walk that way. And if I encounter anything I don't like, I can just ignore it, because you can't. And, that way lies, well, death's maybe a bit dramatic, but that way lies trouble. And I think one of the things that I'm hearing from what you're saying as well is that, if you think about the startup culture of test, verify, adapt, then actually that's having to become, because things change so quickly now, technology, outside events, that in fact you have to almost bring that into the larger organization that maybe in the past was able to get away with being a bit slow, a bit monolithic, and almost setting the rules. Now, because there's so many different organizations, there's so much change, there's so many variables, actually you can't set the rules. You've got to work out how the rules are changing continuously and adapt to go with that flow, right? Is that summarizing it accurately? I don't know.
Yeah, it does. As usual, it's sort of, you can describe the same thing in like 5 or 10 different ways and you'd still be accurate. At the same time, depending who you're talking to, you have to point out a couple of things a bit differently, I think if you look at it from a market opportunity, it's actually super interesting, because we can now address things that are more complex or things that are more personalized, which means I think there's probably 1 million new opportunities out there to fill the gaps in between all these previous silos we had and offer different things that people actually need, that solve people's wicked problems. I like to say that now that we can recognize and test and work on wicked problems because we have better tools and we have better ways of working, we can actually address some things like helping people how to save money better. Before that, all banks could do is like, oh, here's a current account, here's a savings account. Go ahead. It doesn't help anyone save money. It gives you a place where to save the money. But, we did research over when I was working at Nationwide, and we had a couple of really interesting things coming back on how people sometimes don't even perceive that there could be a saver. Given the money they get every month and how they behave around it, actually, there is an opportunity for them to do that, which means there's an opportunity for Nationwide to have another customer. But because people never realize that, they don't start saving, even so they could. And that's a really big missed opportunity and a big value missed for both the customer and an organization. So if Nationwide would start shifting, or other financial organizations would do that, you start exploring different parts of the market that few people have done so. Because that's when you dig into, when you assign yourself with a wicked problem as a company. I find that super interesting. And because wicked problems are so complex and big, as an organization, you can probably easily just claim one area and say, well, this is what we're doing. We're solving that part. Because that's a challenge enough. But we're going to get very good at it. You have a right to exist as a company. So I think there's millions of those things out there that we haven't even dug into because we're quite stuck with sort of very limited kind of products and services. And I think we can go way further out there because we have things like behavioral science and all sorts of other things that pick up on the same thing, bring research, human research into this testing, experimentation, being slowly able to tackle these things. So I find that from a market perspective super interesting. We talked a bit about, the learning inside of an organization is another thing. And I think on an individual level, it's interesting because I think people can quite apply that to themselves and sort of learn on themselves and their skill set and that. And that goes out to the employment market, which now is flooded with people who don't have a job. So there's in theory there a massive opportunity to go, you know what? You're all going to start learning differently. And you can create a new economy. And it's doable. We taught design thinking to thousands of developers over in BT, and it's totally doable. Because a lot of it, oddly enough, is sometimes very common sense. It's just going out there and asking before you build, And
so it's intuitive, almost.
Yeah. So all of these things. So I if industrial revolution and mass production as a tame problem was this thing where here's a product. How can we produce 1 million of those safely? It's all got to be identical. Great. Let's figure this out. With that, you can be more efficient, and efficiency is a big part to play here. And you can actually become very secure in we're producing that, there's demand for it, so we're going to be selling it. So there's money to be made, right? That is a hyper-controlled environment, maybe artificially so. And I think organizations are there still in a bit of a mindset of artificially trying to keep things as they are. And I think that is breaking because reality is just wiping that away. And that is maybe an interesting thing to talk about to leadership as well, to say, look, yes, that's all commodity now. You're not getting anything off that again because someone else can build this in a garage or just send it over to China and get it done in a week. You're not anything special anymore. So therefore, you're not creating a particular perceived customer value anymore. And you need to realize that. It's not where the value is anymore, right?
Yeah, and a good example of that, I suppose, is the challenger banks, right? Where you've got companies like Revolut and Monzo and whoever, and they have behavioral insights built into their platforms. They allow you to, take, let's say, shave off a few cents here and there whenever you spend, so that that's actually going to a savings pot. So you're saving money, which is from a behavioral insight perspective is interesting because you don't feel like you are. They can. I was talking to somebody yesterday who's got a company that does compliance and risk functions, but what they're doing is they're basing it on the neuroscience behind it rather than traditional models of, I just tick a box here and tick a box there, and I've got this RAG report, red, amber, green, that I just list out, which drives, insights, not just for the organization, but also for the regulator and various other actors as well, that just weren't possible before. And part of that is due to the tools, as you say. You've got these huge data analytics tools that we never used to have. But part of it, I think, is really down to this idea that you've hooked onto, which is that, the essence behind design thinking, the whole wicked problems. And as you say, really, it's quite intuitive, but sometimes I think sometimes we're a bit afraid of our own intuitions, because we see other people doing things and we think they must be right.
Yeah. So that's the thing that, we talked a lot on the podcast with Richard Chataway, who sort of works heavily in behavioral science. And he talks about, smoking or people going to the gym and that kind of stuff. And, he works a lot with, nudging people into slightly different behavior that they actually want, not to manipulate them, but basically that. So we talk all kinds of biases. And one interesting thing he said is that I think we have to get to the point where leadership acknowledges and communicates that they have biases like anybody else, right? They can't have all the answers. Plus, what they think should be done often is nudged by their previous experience or the incentives in the business and so on and so on. And they should just recognize it and say, right, in the end, what matters is that we output good quality and we create customer value so we can stay in business and we get as many customers as we can and stick with us because we're doing a good job. Or we can be, because of the great stuff we do, we can be cheaper and therefore, all sorts of different incentives to get customers. But the way to go about it is basically that, I think leadership should more and more ask questions rather than tell what to do. And then let the teams figure out, well, you guys go and check with reality, because I have to do other things. I have to make sure that the investment for your ideas and insight is there. But you go out there and get the insights back. And then we can talk about it. Or you can actually make certain decisions and then ask for the money to build those and test those. This is how this should work. Because there's just no way leadership has the answers anymore. It's so complex and so moving that that's not leadership's job, really, anymore. Again, it goes back to Industrial Revolution when Henry Ford did de-skilling and basically said, right, the people on the floor don't have to think anymore. That's management's work. So management is the brain now, and you are just the arms and the feet and the hands, and you just make stuff. And you don't ask questions. So that doesn't work anymore, right? Because now you have to have every team, every employee being able to think, create insights, and make decisions to improve. Because if you're not letting them, then your company will fall behind because others will do that. And so this whole enabling thing has become a really, really big thing, I think. And I think that's where it gets to this behavioral thing a lot. And I think it's interesting that you see these kind of things coming up. And it's not just data. It's often just, so with data, you often talk about the quantitative aspect of things. And we've been running with the quantitative aspects, ones and zeros, black and white, or particular straight numbers for a long, long time. What also we've not been looking into, and it is harder to measure because we're not used to measuring it, is the qualitative aspect. So what do people's emotions bring out? We know now that sales mechanics, sales decisions are not going back to, well, I got to compare some products and then I'm going to bring my logic in and then I'm going to buy something. There's people proving now that this is all bullshit. People just decide emotionally way, way more often than logically. And that comes down to familiarity bias or other biases where fear strikes you or, I've seen this sort of before, or whatever. And this, again, where advertising is still right and still true, that there's a recognition factor or something that is closer to you that therefore represents less risk, and therefore you go for it. It's all emotionally driven. And that's where behavioral science and these kind of things come now in and go and fill that gap, just by going back out there and talking to people, but in a very different way than we would do back in the 60s, 70s, when you would bring out a poster and ask someone, do you like this? Or you don't like this? And that was about it. Instead of asking, tell me about your day, are you worried about your money? What parts and why and how? Tell us about that in order to get more personalized, get a better context, and actually understand what drives people. And I think that's an interesting trend.
We're we're coming up to time, unfortunately, because I think we could go on and on and on, which often is the case with these things. One thing you touched on earlier is there's a lot of people, sadly, experiencing difficulty in the jobs market now because, and obviously that's COVID related, right? And particularly in industries like hospitality, entertainment, and I'm just wondering if how could we apply something like design thinking or the whole wicked problems scenario in a positive way for those people? And that you might not have the answer. I certainly don't, but I think it's a question. If it's not an answer, that is something that people ought to feel that they can spend time on, because I don't think it's very helpful, for example, to tell people to go and retrain out of their chosen industry. So maybe it's more a question of how do you reframe the problem within that industry. But I don't know. I thought maybe you might have some insights. I don't know if you've even thought about it.
No, I definitely have. Because as much as I talk about the book, I ended up a lot talking about myself. So, myself and my career has gone through lots of changes. So I had to learn certain things and move through different industries, and always had to constantly learning and figuring out where I am and what to do now, right? Especially on change and transformation projects, which tend to often be, they're not defined as clear targets. You have to kind of think on your feet and change often from sprint to sprint, week to week, something like that. And what I've been subconsciously been doing is do that in my head, define problems. Where do I want to go? What do I want to do? What am I going to do next in a project and outside of project? And one thing I came across and I want to do a bit something about as well is, so in Stanford, there's a life design course that actually uses design thinking for students, help them define their career. And it does the same thing. It does the 5 phases. It basically says, define your problem. Tell me a little bit what you think your problem is. Write some hypotheses and start testing, because you can test by talking to people, by throwing things out on social media, and do this. So what I want to do is maybe do a simplified version of that and actually trial this thing out, because I think it could be very valuable. It's not about learning something. It's more about a little bit more awareness of yourself. And it's not trying to be life coaching either. There's something anyway. But it's actually using design thinking on that to say, right, okay, do that. And I don't know if you see a couple of Post-its in my back there. I'm doing the same thing. I put these problems out there. Sometimes they're business related, sometimes they're personal. And so I have personal things where I go, this is a problem. Here's my 3 things I think about. And then I start testing them and I see if I can move on in a particular direction, if they're right or not. And I think that could help people a lot to have a bit of a structure, a bit of a methodology to do that. Because it's really simple. I had that here with friends, and we had a wine here and a drink, and they were looking at all the posters going, what the hell is going on here? I said, well, this and this. I thought, oh, this could be interesting for, because I'm struggling with this. It's like, yeah, it totally applies. That's the beauty of it. That's the beauty of it. You can apply to literally anything, from what shampoo you'd want to buy to, if you should talk to your brother again, potentially. It is a really interesting framework. And I'm not saying it's the solution for everything, because it doesn't provide a solution. You provide a solution, right? But it helps you a little bit more see where you are and help you ask other people questions that will help you.
Yeah, so it helps you frame the problem and then to get feedback on the problem and then to test different solutions and pivot around. And I noticed one of the things, I'll just go back to creative industries for a second, because I think there's a lot of people experiencing problems there and I know there's a problem in other industries as well, but maybe it's not as acute. But one of the things I noticed was one of the comedians was saying that what they normally do is they come up with a number of jokes, right? And then they go and test it at the theatre, and then they take it on a small tour to test out their jokes, and they get lots of feedback, and they'll adjust the set, and then they'll eventually get to the point where they can go around the country and do these bigger venues, right? And then they might have one of those will be televised, or 2 of those will be whatever. And now what they're having to do is actually, because they can't do any of that anymore, they're having to come up with more jokes more frequently without testing them, get them straight out onto social media. And so the volume of their work has gone up, not down. And the creativity aspect of their work has gone up, not down. And of course, we all know that if you are successful in creative media, social media, that is a revenue stream potentially. Now, I'm not saying people should go and do that, but I'm just giving that as an example of how, if you apply that, here's a problem, what else could I do to solve that problem? Because I don't know when this pandemic's going to end. That, in fact, you can then come up with a solution, right? And maybe it's a solution that has to pivot frequently, but it's a solution. So there's a process you can go through, which I thought was quite interesting, which plays to exactly what you're saying, right? Look, we're coming towards the end of our show, alas, and I think it's important that, first of all, we mentioned your book, The Wicked Company. If people want to buy it, where do they go?
They can go straight to Amazon.
Amazon, great. Yeah, and maybe we'll put a link for that and mention it under the episode notes. If they wanted to learn more about yourself, get in touch with you, maybe about the work that you do. I think you said there's a podcast. So what's the podcast called? Where would they find that?
So the podcast is called The Wicked Podcast, and you find that on iTunes and Spotify. And you can find me easily on LinkedIn.
It's probably the entry above this one or something on Spotify and iTunes, I imagine.
Probably somewhere
very close by.
Here, but let's see. Let's have a race.
And then, I imagine you've got a website, or are there other ways that people can get in touch with you? What's the best thing?
So the website is thewickedcompany.com. Very simple, and that's just a little bit me introduction. But again, it's mainly to get through to me, contact, understand a bit of what I do. So, and it's everything from helping leadership to helping run programs to consulting on strategy and just to implement those things, because it's a multitude of issues to tackle, and there's a lot of hygiene factors you want to get right before you start certain things. And I'm helping with those. So, the main thing is just get in contact and say hello, and then we talk about your problems.
And that would be from thewickedcompany.com.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Marcus, it's been great talking to you. Thank you very, very much for taking part. And best of luck with everything.
It's very lovely talking to you, Toby.